Okay, after working long hours all week, the Senate Finance Committee may leave town this week without tackling perhaps the two most controversial parts of health care reform: public option and a tax on so-called Cadillac plans. I am joined now by Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican from Utah and a member of the committee. Senator Hatch, it's good to talk to you. We've been trying to get you on all week, and I mentioned just a moment ago we got filibustered in our first attempt by the Libyan leader, but it's good to have you on the program. Got to ask you, what is your goal as you define it for the end of this day, the end of this week? What do you want to get accomplished?
Well, we wanted to try and get some more transparency on this program. You know, this bill, this is the copy of the conceptual bill. It's 220 pages long. In other words, it's written in everyday language, but the final bill is going to be something like 1,000 pages. It's going to be 4 or 5 times as large as this. And frankly, I think we've got to have that final bill, and we need to have that scored by the Congressional Budget Office so we know what we're getting involved in here. We filed an amendment and called it up and had it debated. It was a Jim Bunning amendment. I was a prime co-sponsor on it that said, look, before this becomes final, before we have a final vote, we should know exactly what's in the bill. It ought to be the true legislative language, not just conceptual language, and we ought to have it scored, and that was voted down. Now, it makes you wonder, since the party of transparency, the Democratic Party, is always talking about transparency, why they wouldn't be willing to agree to that, because that just makes sense.
Yeah, I got a quick question on that. Is it true, or maybe it isn't, that aspects of this, the amendments, that some of the amendments are being scored as we go along here, and that changes are being scored as well? I was listening and watching the other night, and there were a few amendments that were proposed that had already been scored.
Well, generally the ones by the chairman that he's agreed to are being scored. But keep in mind, they're scored, but they're not scored in the overall package.
Gotcha.
And we have no idea how much it's going to be. It was supposed to be under $800 billion. It's already up to $900 billion with some of the agreements that the chairman has made. And look, that doesn't even count the first 3 or 4 years. So if you score it over 10 years, it's at least $1.5 trillion to maybe even as high as $2 trillion. Now, look, if we're going to turn health care over to the almighty federal government, you can count on costs going up even more than that.
Will the committee get to debate before the end of this day the so-called public option amendments? Will that happen today?
No, they're going to put that off till Tuesday because that's going to take quite a bit of time. And most of the very liberal Democrats are really hell-bent on getting a public option in there. I think almost anybody else who thinks about it would say we don't want to turn health care over to a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington who then will determine what kind of health care we can have, and you know that rationing is going to happen. And frankly, when they say that it would be on a level playing field, look, this is the outfit that ran Medicare into $38 trillion in unfunded liability. Do we want to turn over all health care to them right here in Washington and interject bureaucrats between you and your doctor? I don't want to.
Hey, can I ask you this one on the bottom line question here? It is my sense in listening to you that you're not going to vote for anything. You're not going to vote in favor of anything that comes out of this committee, and I believe that is pinned to a basic belief that I've heard you express, that anything that comes out of this committee will ultimately be a first step on the road to a government takeover of health care. Do I have that correct?
No, because actually this committee bill is about as moderate a bill as you can find from a Democratic standpoint. But if we pass it out of committee, which I think the Democrats will do, then they're going to meld it with the Help Committee bill, which is a total Democrat bill. By the time they get through with this, it's going to be the most god-awful thing you've ever seen.
I see.
And frankly, that's the problem. Now, we have voted for some amendments that we think have merit, but everything that they seem to be pushing, it seems to be moving more and more towards this government takeover of health care. And if that happens, and look, they're going to have employer mandates, employee mandates. Employer mandates really kill people on the lower end of the earning spectrum. Employee mandates are very, very difficult. They said they're not going to cost people who make less than $200,000, and yet it's going to cost them an awful lot of money. Anybody over $66,000 that doesn't have a federal Washington health care plan is going to have to pay an extra $2,000 penalty.
So theoretically, you could possibly support something that comes out of this committee, but by the time it gets to the reconciliation process with what's been worked on in health, in your mind, that becomes unworkable for you?
Well, it's possible I could, but keep in mind, remember how I described it? It's a Democrat, it's moderate for Democrats. It's still very liberal, and it still emphasizes Washington more than it should, and it still isn't in a form that we can really determine how much it's really going to cost.
Well, well, that's good. I think we had a good talk here today.
Well,
Senator,
you asked some good questions.
well, Senator Hatch, I appreciate that. Thank you, and have a great weekend, and we'll let you get back to work. In just a moment, we will